Okay, so then it falls to me just to welcome all of you. Warm welcome, and I'm glad that you followed us over to Zoom. I'm sorry about that late switch. I'm Dorothea von Moltke. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books, and I'm very glad that you're here. We're here to honor and to celebrate Anna Arabindan-Kesson's fabulous new book, Black Bodies, White Gold. Here it is, Art, Cotton, and Commerce in the Atlantic World. I'm just going to hold it up. There it is. Get your copy. I am grateful to the African American Studies Department in particular for having put this on my radar and helped to make this happen. They and the Art and Archaeology Department and also the program in African Studies are co-sponsors tonight. So my thanks to all of them. And before I introduce our guests in just a minute, a word about practicalities. This is familiar to you in the webinar form. We're going to use the Q&A for the questions. So rather than the chat, please put your questions there. And we hope you have many, and just queue them up as they come to you. I also want to quickly let you know that you can, of course, order a copy of Black Bodies, White Gold on our website on labyrinthbooks.com, or stop by the store or call us or email us. And I have put in the chat the information you might need for that. Just remember that you can enter Kesson at checkout online and get 10% off. But on now to Anna Arabindan-Kesson and her colleague and fellow art historian, Chika Okeke-Agulu. So Anna is assistant professor of Black diasporic art in the African American Studies and Art and Archaeology departments at Princeton. She currently has 2 new book projects in the works. One is a co-authored project with Mia Bagneris and is called Beyond Recovery, Reframing the Dialogues of 19th-century Black Diaspora Art. Her second monograph is called An Empire State of Mind, Plantation Imaginaries, Colonial Medicine, and Ways of Seeing. How great that Chika, you can also be here tonight. Chika too has joint appointments in both African American Studies and Art and Archaeology at Princeton, along with being the director of African Studies. For as long as I think I can remember this, I think you've been in that post for a while. And a quick look at some of Chika's work will tell you that many of his interests intersect and overlap with Anna's interests in Black diasporic and contemporary art. He is the author of Post-Colonial Modernism, Art and Decolonization in 20th Century Nigeria, and also of 2 books on African artists. One is Yusuf Grillo, Painting Lagos Life, and Obiora Udechukwu, help me with that, Line, Image, Text. Chika is himself a widely exhibited artist. He's also a curator and has curated many more exhibits than I can list. So before handing the mic now to these exceptional 2 scholars, I just want to say what an absorbing read Black Bodies, White Gold is. It gives us new terms, new constellations for thinking together representations and valuations of cotton and of Black bodies from slavery to sharecropping and through all stages and conditions of the production of that cotton, also its trade. All this is refracted then through the lens of contemporary Black artists. So it's very complex, very, very rich. It's an engrossing project of historicizing vision and of making the material archive speak, even and maybe especially when it hides. So how did and do images construct the Black body as commodity and as signifying a market relation? And what images might yet help perform a kind of rescue from that insidious collusion of representation and commodification? There's so many questions in this book that are posed and answered, and they're posed in order maybe as yet to be answered. And so how wonderful that we have you both here, Anna and Chika, to surface some of those questions for us. And I'll let you take it away. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Dorothea. This is a wonderful occasion to have a conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Anna, who has written really a wonderful, incredibly important book, and I'm thrilled to associate myself with Anna and her work. I'm really, truly proud of being your colleague. Let me just say that out in the open. I've said it to you so many times in different ways. And so the opportunity to have a chat about this work is one that I could not pass, when it came about. So this is, for me, a moment to think about some of the key ideas and questions that the book sort of raises for us. As I mentioned to you, I think yesterday, I have no interest in trying, for us to give folks out there, an alternative to reading the book, right? So hopefully we'll touch on some of these issues, and then, folks will be compelled to go read and find out if what we're saying actually is in the book. So having said that, I'm also reminded of one of these popular maxims, right? Never judge a book by the cover. Well, I'm not sure about that. And that's actually how I want to begin this conversation with hold on, what's going on with my presentation? Just a second. Okay. So I'm thrilled and intrigued by your cover image. Fantastic cover design, so props to the Duke, press folks. But it's the cover image for this book, right? I understand from those who publish books that there's a lot of thought that goes into the cover image, which is to say that you actually can begin to judge a book by the cover, given the amount of attention given to that choice. And so I'm wondering, Anna, how you came about this cover image, precisely because for me, it's so apt, right, to the book and its title, right? And so I'm wondering what came before. This is not quite the chicken and egg, thing, but did you write the book because of the image, or you found this image in the process, right, of thinking through the key questions that you're asking with the book? So if you can just help me, understand what's going on. And of course we have these other two images on the screen. So perhaps if you could speak a little bit about this, cover image situation, that would be great.
Sure. First of all, thank you to my departments, to Dorothea for hosting this, and Chika, as always, it is always an honor for me to be in conversation, but also truly a joy. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time out to do this. That's a really good question. The book was already kind of, in process fermentation before I found Hank's work, or this particular work. But when I did see it, and I saw it when I was visiting his cousin, actually, I was like, oh, this sums up everything. And so it has to be on the cover. But before that, I knew his other work, the Cotton Ball, which we'll come to later. But
yes.
But so so the narrative was there, or it was being shaped, and then this work emerged, and it certainly helped me to make some of the connections and arguments I'm trying to make stronger, because I think often that when I'm kind of doing my research and theorizing, it's often the work of contemporary artists that they literally kind of materialize what it is I'm trying to say. And so this was, I guess, a kind of real life moment where that happened. And then the poster that you have is the original work that at least that Hank was drawing on. So he talks about looking through old magazines and archived material, and he found this poster, and so then he sort of repurposed it, reprinted it, but it comes from this band from Nashville, I think, called the Butterscotch Booth, and you can see this band and this song on YouTube if you would like.
Yeah, I'm going to check them out. Right.
Yeah.
So when you found the Hank Willis image, and then you traced it back to the music poster, basically, right, from this group. That says something about what you're trying to do in this book, or what you've done, right, in this book, and you mentioned it briefly, which is engaging with the work of contemporary artists as a platform for investigating, for looking, for examining long past histories, right, which is where you situate yourself, for a good part, as a scholar, as an art historian of the 18th, 19th century art and visual cultures, right? Which is, of course, what you're examining in Black Bodies, White Gold. And I'm quite interested in that dynamic, right? It's not just that you found what looks like an apt cover image, right, of Black hands clutching white cotton, but it's that you look to the work of contemporary artists and image makers as vital resources, right? Vital data and tools, right, for looking at this in a good measure distant past, right, of African diasporic, right, peoples. And this is something that I think needs, to be discussed, to be talked about. What this means, right, to you as a scholar, precisely because it's quite a distance in terms of art history, right, as a field. We tend to think of 18th and 19th century as a separate subfield of art history, and then there's contemporary art. But in your work, you're bridging, right, both, and you do that marvelously in this book, and we'll talk a bit about this. But just for a start, what does this mean for you to do this kind of work, bearing in mind, for instance, the work of Saidiya Hartman, which has been quite influential, right, in how recent scholarship, deals with pasts that have a very little or no footprint in the archive, right? What she describes as a critical fabulation. The number of scholars that you and I are aware of have used as a critical tool for looking especially at African diasporic histories and visual practices, right? How do you situate what you're doing with the work of contemporary artists, right? Vis-a-vis this idea of how to deal with a past, of which the archive is scant, right? If you can talk a little bit about that, because I think that it's a very important intervention, perhaps even an alternative approach to how to deal with, the past and its archives, or lack of archival resources.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think Hank's work is a helpful example here, because, questions for me that always come up in my work is, how do I approach the archive? And when I talk about archives, I'm also talking about historical visual material, in which, you see the continued commodification and violence perpetrated against Black lives. So how do I look at these historical images without looking with them, I suppose is the question that I'm always thinking through. And I think someone like Hank Willis Thomas, who is also looking at the archive and thinking about how archival images are recirculated, repurposed, and how these circuits of vision continue to frame, right, the way we see each other now and see each other in the past. And so I think someone like Hank, in a way, he allows me, or he gives me a language and another, as you said, another kind of position or orientation towards archival material, towards colonial visual cultures. But there's also a way that, when I looked at this work, what you're seeing there is exactly this kind of equivalence between cotton and Black lives, right? In the way that these hands are holding the cotton. It's also, they look like they're shackled. There are all of these sort of tropes and histories encoded in that. But because of the way Hank has sort of repurposed this print through the carborundum printing process, creating this very gritty yet almost haptic surface, I think there's also a way in which he compels us to look in a different way. And so again, that I think that's another entry point into these archival silences, right? That's looking perhaps for other registers or other affective realms, as Tina Camp also, talks about. And for me, that was also a way to start thinking about the intersection of the tactile, the haptic, and the visual, as another way of confronting what Saidiya Hartman's talking about, these elisions and these silences.
And of course, another artist that is quite important to your thinking around this question, right, of the relationship between cotton and bodies, right, is Lubaina Himid. I believe you became aware of her work much earlier, right, than Hank Willis Thomas. So if you can talk a bit about what Lubaina Himid's work and practice did, to sort of catalyzing or perhaps even sharpening your critical perspective, right, on the age of slavery, the visual practices, and the commercial, right, networks and connections between, cotton and Black bodies. That is, of course, the subject of your book. So, yeah, Lubaina Himid, where does her work situate, right, in your own scholarly imagination and in the way that led to the work that became, Black Bodies, White Gold?
I mean, I think like you, so much of the work I do really comes from conversations I have with contemporary artists. And so, I mean, I think in many ways the book is really kind of what was or came into being in many ways through conversations with Lubaina, and this work in particular. So this is its first iteration. It was as you can see there, there's this grid of canvases that faced this brass plaque with a quote that she had found in actually it's in a travel account written by Frederick Olmsted when he visits a plantation in the early 1860s. And it was made originally to
Frederick Olmsted?
Frederick Olmsted, the architect who spent, he travels through the South extensively and writes, this very comprehensive account of different plantations that he visits. And so she found this quote looking through that. So she made it for an exhibition that was looking at Manchester, England's hidden histories. And the exhibition was held in a former cotton warehouse. So, she talks about this work in similar ways to how Saidiya Hartman talks about her relationship to the archive. So she wanted to create a work that examined the ways cotton connected, different places. But as we talked about that, we both understood, right, that these ideas of connection that come from trade or commerce often allied the realities of labor, of violence, of slavery. And so here she's using that kind of that network of trade that cotton literally creates.
And of course, Manchester was basically the cotton capital, right, exactly, of the British Empire. That's where the factories that produced fabrics for empire.
Exactly. Yes. It was called Cottonopolis, the workshop of the world. So that so she's tracing here that movement from the plantation, cotton bales coming to Manchester, being worked on by factory operatives who were also, mistreated, impoverished, and then those textiles and thread being sent across the empire. And so the canvases are all in black and white, and they were originally meant to number 100, and they're copied from textile patterns from 19th century sample books. But the reason they're black and white is because she's trying to materialize moments of connection between enslaved people and these white cotton factory operatives. And so she talks about imagining how these bales of cotton might have carried with them bits of skin or blood or, hair from enslaved people. So again, like really emphasizing that connection. But she's also called at cotton.com to reflect on the letters that were sent by cotton operatives to Lincoln in support of emancipation. So these little canvases are both moments of physical or material connection through the paint, and they're also painted on cotton, but they're also symbolic gestures of communication.
Right. Okay. So let's continue, Anna, and just shift a little bit to another aspect of this book that I would like for us to chat a bit about, and that is what you have proposed as the speculative vision, and an argument really about the equivalence, right, that was drawn both in the commercial and visual worlds, of Black bodies and cotton. And the two images that are from your book, right, that we're seeing on the screen now, I think help us to think about this idea of a speculative vision. But if it will be great, of course, if you can talk a little bit about what this term means, so that for those of us who are looking for new terms to sort of deploy to sound like we're really smart, as I do all the time. So I can use speculative vision next time and not think that I don't know what I'm talking about. So if you can sort of help us think through what you mean by that term, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I'll try to make it clear. When you're in the middle of something and it's been in there, it's always hard to detangle.
Mm-hmm.
But I think these, I was a little nervous about putting these two images together and making this connection, but I think it works. Where I get to this idea of speculative vision is really from Frederick Douglass, right? He talks in one of his lectures, he says, as the price of cotton goes up, so too does the value of a slave. And this is a lecture he gives to abolitionists in London. And so that kind of economic correlation, I think, is not just about the market value, but it's also about how Blackness is framed in terms of viewership. And so in this print, right, what we're seeing is a plantation owner or a dealer inspecting an enslaved person, and this way of seeing, or this inspection, this form of valuation, is predicated on this idea of a future profit, or potential profit, right? And so that's what I was thinking about in terms of speculative vision, because I think there's always this way in which Blackness is understood as having to prove its value, right? And that's something that I talk about in terms of the relationship between cotton and Blackness, during slavery, but also I think it's a way of seeing and valuing Black lives that continues post-slavery and into the present day. And I was also, the reason I put it next to the Degas painting is because I think there is a way that this kind of viewership overlaps with the kind of idealization or abstraction that comes with art, and and it's something that Lubaina talks about in cotton.com, with that quote where we see this enslaved woman literally being turned into a picture. And so in the Degas, again, like this Degas painting, it's set in his uncle's cotton office in New Orleans. He writes about coming to New Orleans in order to make a picture that would help his family out of their financial troubles, right? So he's thinking about the future value of his work and his painting. So
the painting itself is instrumental, right?
Exactly.
It's not simply picture making. He is deploying painting for the service of family, basically.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and he had a cotton merchant in mind in Manchester, and I think there's this really throughout the painting, all we're seeing is forms of assessment or valuation. His uncle in the foreground, his uncle's partners in the background were assessing the cotton, and then his brother in the middle checking the profits in the stock market, the accountants on the to the side who are literally dematerializing cotton into its exchange value, and so there's a way in which too, I think for Degas, right, this whole painting, like we too are supposed to assess it, or at least his audience then, right, because he wanted Agnew, this cotton merchant, to pay a lot of money for it. I mean, it didn't work, but
I think why I think this juxtaposition works even further for me is that the action of his uncle, Degas's uncle in the foreground, is pretty much what this dealer or potential buyer of an enslaved man is doing, inspecting the commodity, right? They are both doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And who is the seated guy in both paintings, right? It's the guy checking out the newspapers, the news of what's happening in the commodity market, right? So there's a very strong equivalence, right, between what is pictorially taking place, right, in one image and in the other, and that's why the sort of very nimble shifts that happens in your book between thinking about this idea of the commodification, right, or of the commodified Black body and its relationship with the more normative commodity, right? When we think about commodities market, we think about materials, primary products, right? And not necessarily human bodies, right? But what you show throughout the book is that the commodification, right, of cotton in this particular study went on in tandem and actually adopted similar strategies as the ones that were deployed in the sale and merchandising, right, and valuation of human bodies. And I think that that's what the Hank Willis Thomas cotton bowl, right, brings to the fore again, but I think looking at more recent history, right, of sharecropping, and of course, contemporary sport. And I think that that's where, for me, what you do in this book, which is to pay such close and vigorous attention to, the trade in cotton and bodies in a time that both went in tandem, and then to look at how contemporary artists are meditating on contemporary manifestations, or what Huey Copeland would call the recrudescence in his own study, Bound to Appear, the recrudescence of slavery, he calls it, in the work of contemporary artists. And so I want to hear what you think about this, right? Because for Huey Copeland, he is a historian of contemporary art, right? Looking at the sort of return, right, or the re-emergence in contemporary art of memories encoded in images in the work of contemporary artists. But you're almost doing, and I want to hear you out on this, almost the reverse, right, of looking at the work of contemporary artists as a way to understand or to have a more a critical understanding of the visual cultures of a distant, what is now a distant past, that past that is not well accounted for in the archive. So this, how do you see this working? I've asked this question before, but we're also returning to it again, because I think that there's something so important, right, about how you're using the present almost as if it's an archive to study the past, right? Using the work of artists who are thinking about the past as if they are archival resources, which is not how we think about archives, right? As they are past that we use to study the present. Here, it seems as if you're deploying the present in order to figure out unanswered or unclear questions, right, about the past.
Yeah, that's a big question. But yes, I think you're right. I mean, I love this work by Hank, The Cotton Ball, because I feel like that's sort of where my position is, right? Not, with the football, kind of looking back and sort of tracing those resonances back. I mean, just to maybe try and explain this further, in the Degas, for example, in the Degas painting, of course, what we don't see are the black lives and the black bodies, right, that are picking that cotton. So that kind of assessment that's taking place, it's an assessment of cotton, it's an assessment perhaps of Degas' labor, but it's also it's an assessment based on this invisibility, right, and the commodification of black lives, which I think has often been part of the narrative of art history, and so I think that's why, for me, contemporary artists like Hank, they materialize what they materialize positions that we can take now to find those hidden narratives or unseen narratives, and I think they do so because one of the ways they're dealing with the legacies of slavery, or as Huey says, is by compelling us to see how the ways in which we look now is still so much embedded in those histories of commodification. And so in a way, I think to start to disassemble them now requires disassembling, or at least being able to see how they're constructed in the past. I guess that's one way I'm trying to think about, you know, how I use these contemporary artists, you know, as a kind of as a framework or a portal into, you know, into these archival moments.
Yeah, and of course, you know, there are other contemporary artists that you engage with their works, you know, as part of your tactics, right? Your multi-perspectival tactic of dealing with commodity and commodification in the age of slavery, right? And the ways that materiality functions in one artist and, you know, and the other. If you could talk a bit about this image, you know, that looks like, you know, it's a factory, you know, bales of cotton. Is this from Manchester or something?
Actually, I can't remember where. This is Leonardo Drew's untitled number 25. I can't remember where this is. It's in a gallery space, but I can't remember.
Of course, yes.
But it does. I mean, you're right. It does look just like a factory, like Lubaina's work. I'm not sure if I'm sure you've walked around this piece, but I mean, it's enormous and it's so overwhelming in its hapticality. And you know, you really do. So again, I think there's this, you know, there's a way in which this sort of interest in the surface of things is really, and the feel of things kind of connects transhistorically these works. But and I think that Drew is also, you know, emphasizing he has something to do with the ways that looking at an artwork, you know, and kind of assessing its surface. He's making connections here too, I think, about the kind of commodification of Black artists and Black art. But Drew, you know, Drew is, I think, very interested in sort of viewing positions, where we stand now, how we look now. And, you know, his work is always about the material, and he talks about cotton as having a material with memory, which I just love, because, you know, I think it goes again into, it helps us understand these sort of embedded layers of meaning and connection.
Yeah, and of course you did reference Lubaina's discussion about, you know, cotton. It might even have the blood or skin cells, right, of the workers that picked them and processed them, you know, in their time as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But, you know, Leonardo Drew also, he doesn't work with figures, so he never kind of brings the black body into his work, but which is why, again, I say he's always asking us to think about how Blackness, how we're viewing, right, this subject. But he made, you know, these bales he made himself. So he used wax to stick the layers together, and he carried them. He was working in a loft studio, so he's kind of carrying them up and down. And so that kind of that labor, the repetitive labor too of cotton work, is deeply embedded in this piece. And so one of the things that struck me when I showed it to colleagues here at Princeton, actually, was someone said it reminded, this was just not long after Eric Garner had been murdered, and she said she looked at this and was sort of felt like she couldn't breathe, like she felt suffocated just
the way it chokes up the space in the room.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I think in a way that, you know, that cotton's iconicity has that effect in, you know, particularly in US history and US visual culture. So I think there's I mean, I could go on, but
Yeah. Of course, another artist that you look at in, well, several artists, of course, there's the Brunias, which hopefully you can talk a little bit about, but also Yinka Shonibare, whose work is really, cotton is so involved, right, in his practice, but in a very different way from, say, Leonardo Drew, right? Yeah. Or even Lubaina Himid in terms of the type of politics of identity or the relationship between cotton and bodies, but also cultures and commodification. So if now that we have these three artists, right, Brunias, and then Lubaina one more time, and then Yinka Shonibare, the sort of connections that you're making, right, in your book across time, right, across art histories, right? It's not just Degas, who is better known for, right, his work as a French painter, devoid of these connections to, you know, merchandising that bought for Europe a middle class, right? The labor of the Black bodies in the tropics, you know, on which a middle class, the emergence of a middle class in Europe depended. And of course, we tend to think about the art associated with that culture, the leisure class and leisure lifestyle and so forth. That couldn't happen if not, right, for the laboring bodies, right, in the so-called New World that was producing the cash crops on which the industries in Europe depended. And so in these three works, we see different ways that these histories, right, and cultures intersect, of power, you know, middle-class socialities, but also the different forms of racial identities that became part of the age of slavery, right, in say the Brunias. So if you can, you know, talk a bit about these artists and works and their incidents, right, in your book.
Yes. Okay, I'll try and do this succinctly, Chika. Well, I think you've done it for me, but so I'll start with Brunias, because I think exactly as you were saying, the ways that, you know, these spaces of the Caribbean and West Africa, these laboring enslaved bodies underpin European sociality and sociability and consumption is exactly what Brunias is dealing with. But and so, you know, these market scenes to me were really crucial to kind of highlight. You know, we see the ships, we see the commodities, both in terms of cloth and enslaved bodies. But what's also really, I think, important to highlight with Brunias is that he's depicting these textiles that, you know, that Lubaina also draws on, these pattern textiles, and he's depicting kind of designs that British and Europeans were imitating from India in order to, you know, to use as currency in the slave trade. And you know, cloth was you know, the value of an enslaved person was often described using the term piece. So, you know, so these pieces of cloth were literally forms of currency. But the kind of other kind of aspect of that, which is what Yinka's, I think, working with, is that these these kind of these forms of imitation of Indian textiles that Europeans were producing was also about West African consumer taste and forms of consumption and desire, and you know that's another that sort of history tells another is another kind of, I suppose, speculative moment of connection that Yinka's dealing with, I think, in this work, Scramble for Africa, you know, with his use of textiles. You know, he's highlighting these other kinds of alliances, of performances of identity that come from the kind of intersection of the Indian and Atlantic Ocean worlds. But he's also doing that while emphasizing colonialism as a kind of speculative venture, right? These are these headless mannequins around a map of Africa. It is in response to the conference in Berlin, in which, you know, the continent was literally chopped up into pieces for European powers. So I think you know, I kind of end with Yinka's work because it allows me to, or it allows us to think, you know, through these relationships of commerce and trade and commodification, but also I think he's so playful and he's so aware of these nuances that it allows us to, I think, also think speculatively in other ways about these other kinds of intimacies, right? That cotton mediated beyond the kind of European colonial gaze.
Okay. I think we will need to start heading towards a conclusion, you know, thinking about the time, and also to take questions if there are any, to, you know, guide us towards a conclusion. So let me see what we have in the questions. Okay, yes, there's a raise of hand. How does that work? When I think we need to have the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we do have one question now in the queue. If you want to take a look at that one, and
yes,
if
I'm looking at it now.
has any other questions, then this would be a good time to put them there, and then we can wrap up after that.
Sure. Well, there's a question here that says, do you agree with the recent decision by PFA to delete images of Thomas Erskines from its online digital database? It's saying so many bad actors exist and have existed throughout art history, and some artists utilize their imagery as well as their words to speak out and provide their own opinions and response. How will the removal of the imagery of the past affect their backwards discourse? Thank you.
I'm not sure. I don't know about this, but I mean, do you want me to answer this?
Yeah, I'm not sure about
with the imagery of the past. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I guess the basic question is what, asking for an opinion, right, about deleting Thomas Erskine's images. I personally have no, insight into this, what's been described here.
No, I didn't know that this had happened.
Yeah. So I think we'll pass on that question. Sorry, Elise.
Thank you for letting us know. I have to go and look this up.
Yeah. But if there are questions about, Anna's book or what we've been discussing so far this evening, or not described to your satisfaction, this would be a time, right, to ask questions.
And sometimes I find that also when a presentation has been especially multifaceted and rich and engrossing, it can be hard to step away and find a question to ask about it. So no harm in that if folks are also ready for dinner, and
yes, I'm sure
that's also fine.
Yeah.
There is one question now. Maybe we will take that because it's from a PK-12 educator who is asking what you believe the importance of art history, especially on commodification, can play on dispelling myths and lies about US history. So she's asking a very general question, or he, about the role, and I think your conversation has exemplified some of what it can be, but maybe if you want to just give a more general comment as a concluding comment, Anna.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is a great question. And I think for me, the importance of art history, at schools is really about teaching people how to see and how to understand how images are put together, and the meanings behind that that practice and process. So while contemporary art can help us understand history, I think it's also really important for us to see, particularly given our context, and the ways that images circulate, how it's important for us to be thinking about and teaching not just kids, but people, right, about how images function, and how we can read them.
Yeah, and I think, and this is why I brought back this image, because it precisely does respond to this question, right? For folks who are into football, I'm not sure how many of them have really thought about the fact that there's something called Cotton Bowl, right? And it's supposed to be one of the most important football games in college football, right? But it's called Cotton Bowl. And what Hank Willis Thomas does in this is to actually make us think, right, about some of the symbols, right, of the nation, right, of the society that are taken as natural or normative, but which come out of difficult histories that, both the knowledgeable ones and others don't want to revisit, because, that the past can be a site of shame or pain. And so the work of contemporary artists, the work of artists writ large, can serve as paths, if not tools, for re-engaging with difficult questions of our past and present, and in the way that in the series of work that Hank Willis has done, because he's always looking at images from the past that have resonances to some of the questions and debates that we're having in the present, right? The influence of the media, for instance, that we constantly grapple with in the present. We find in his work and others, and he's not the only one working in this mode, but given that his work is also very important to what Anna is doing in her book, I signal that just to point to the reason that Anna actually is looking at his work as a way to have a clearer understanding, right, of the past in all its complexities, perhaps even ugliness. And so this is one example of how contemporary art can help us or provide us tools, right, for thinking about not just the past, but also our present, right?
So maybe I'll just close with a very small thank you for something that I experienced in reading your book, Anna, which is that, you know, the concept, because it's so theoretically rich also, and the concept of reification can be a recalcitrant one if you're not, you know, steeped in your marks all the time. And I felt in reading like you were sort of taking me and saying, let me show you how you can actually see reification. And so much there, so much in that book, so much in this conversation between the two of you tonight. Thank you for that. Thank you for your patience, everyone, in following us here and then letting us deal with interruptions. And we'll hope to see you in person soon or again on another event, either here on Zoom or on our other platform. But for now, I wish you all a good night and be well, take good care. So goodbye. Would you stop the recording when we're all done? Bye, and thank you, Anna. Thank you, Chika.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
All righty.